By the time people finally started asking where I had been all those years, I was already too tired to give them a simple answer. Not because it was hard to explain, but because it meant going back to a part of my life I had learned to keep very quiet. I live in a place where quiet isn't just the absence of sound. It's a weight. It presses on your ears, on your chest, the way heavy snow presses on the roof of an old cabin. You don't notice it at first, but you feel it every time you breathe. My cabin sits in a long fold of timber and rock in the northern range, far from any paved road. The closest town is almost an hour away when the weather is good, and sometimes 3 when the snow comes down heavy. There's a dirt track that leads out here, cut by old logging trucks decades ago, and now it's mostly used by me and the deer. In the mornings, I can hear the wind working through the spruce, a low shushing sound, like someone brushing dust off a shelf. Sometimes, a raven will land on the fence post and tap its beak against the wood. That sound always reminds me I'm still here. I'm not young anymore. My hands are thick and cracked from years of cutting firewood and fixing what breaks instead of buying something new. When I wake up, my knees take a moment before they remember how to move. The kettle whistles the same way it always has, thin and sharp, and I pour hot water over grounds I've already used once. Out here you don't waste things, not coffee, not nails, not daylight. The floorboards creak under my weight, and I know which ones will complain before I step on them. That's how long I've been here. I didn't always plan to live this way. Like most people, I thought I'd end up somewhere with neighbors close enough to borrow sugar from, maybe a porch light across the street to keep the dog company. That didn't happen. My wife passed a long time ago, quiet and sudden, the kind of passing that doesn't leave you angry, just empty. After that, the house in town felt too loud, even when no one was there. Every little sound echoed off the walls, and I couldn't tell if it was the pipes or my own breathing. So I came back to this land I'd inherited from my father, a stretch of woods and creek he used to bring me to when I was small. Out here, things make sense. If it's cold, you put on another layer. If the generator won't start, you clean the plugs. If the wind howls through the trees at night, it's just the wind. The animals follow their paths. The seasons do what they've always done. I built my cabin with my own hands, one beam at a time, the smell of fresh-cut pine filling the air. Even now, on warm days, the wood still holds a hint of that scent, mixed with smoke from the stove and damp earth. From boots left by the door. This place became my whole world without me noticing it happen. The creek out back runs clear and cold, and in spring you can hear it long before you see it. Water knocking stones together like loose change. I set my traps along its banks and check them every morning, the metal cold against my fingers. The deer move through the lower meadow at dusk, their hooves soft in the grass. I know where they'll appear, the same way you know where the sun will set. I don't get many visitors. Once in a while, a ranger will come by, or someone lost will knock on the door, their face pale and unsure. When they leave, the quiet comes back heavier than before, like it was waiting for them to go. I talk to myself more than I probably should, just to hear a voice. Sometimes I read out loud, old paperbacks with their spines broken, the words filling the room like a low fire. People think loneliness is about being sad. It isn't. It's about being small. When there's no one around to see you, you start to feel like you might disappear if you don't keep moving. So I work. I mend fences. I split wood. I walk the boundary lines of my land, the dirt firm under my boots, the sky wide and pale above the trees. This land knows me. It has watched me grow older, the way the moss grows thicker on the north side of the rocks. Everything I had left was here. The cabin, the creek, the animals that passed through, and the quiet that wrapped around me every night. I didn't know then that I wasn't as alone as I believed. I just knew that this place was all I had. And I held onto it the way a man holds onto a railing in the dark. Not because it's beautiful, but because it keeps him from falling. The first thing that changed was the animals. At first I blamed the weather. Late fall had come in uneven, warm days followed by sudden cold nights, and animals don't like surprises any more than people do. But even with that in mind, what I started seeing didn't sit right. The deer stopped coming into the meadow the way they always had. I'd look out from the porch at dusk, the sky fading from gray to a thin, washed-out blue, and the grass would be empty. No soft steps, no flick of ears, just wind moving through the tall weeds, making them whisper against one another. My traps began to come back untouched. That almost never happens out here. A fox, a raccoon, even a curious bird will usually trip something. But the steeljaws stayed clean, dusted only with frost. When I knelt to check them, the cold soaked through my jeans and into my knees, and I felt like I was kneeling in a room where everyone had just left in a hurry. The creek still ran, and I could hear it over the low hum in my ears. But even that sounded different, like it was keeping its voice down. One morning I found my chickens bunched together against the far side of their pen. They weren't squawking or running. They were just standing there, feathers puffed, eyes fixed on the tree line. When I stepped closer, they didn't move. Usually they scatter when I open the gate, kicking dirt and clucking. That day they held still, as if whatever they were watching mattered more than me. I followed their gaze, but all I saw was the dark of the woods and a thin mist rising between the trunks. The sounds at night started to change, too. I'm used to coyotes, to owls, to the steady rustle of small animals in the brush. Those sounds have a rhythm you get to know. But now there were long stretches of nothing, followed by a low, distant noise I couldn't place. It wasn't a howl or a call. It was more like something shifting its weight far away, a deep, soft scrape carried by the wind. Sometimes it came from the ridge behind the cabin, sometimes from down by the creek. It was never loud, just enough to make me stop what I was doing and listen. I began to find tracks where there shouldn't have been any. Not clear prints, not like a deer or a bear leaves behind. Just pressed grass, broken twigs, and the faint impression of something heavy moving through. One afternoon, the sun low and weak, I walked the perimeter fence and noticed a stretch where the wire had been pushed down. Not cut, not broken. Just bent inward, like something had leaned against it and then gone on its way. The soil beneath was scuffed, the dirt darker where it had been disturbed. I knelt and ran my fingers over it. The ground was cold and slightly damp, and the marks were too wide to belong to anything I knew. I told myself it was probably a moose. They can move quietly when they want to, and they're big enough to bend a fence. Still, the shape of the disturbance didn't match what I'd seen before. It was as if whatever had passed through had tried not to leave much behind. That idea sat in my chest in an uncomfortable way. Even my dog, old Rusty, began to act off. He wouldn't stray far from the porch anymore. When I took him down toward the creek, he'd stop and plant his feet, ears back, a low whine in his throat. Once, when a gust of wind brought that soft scraping sound closer, he let out a sharp bark and then went quiet, tail tucked. I crouched and put a hand on his back, feeling the tension under his fur. The air smelled of wet leaves and something else I couldn't name. There was no single moment that made me afraid. It was the way all these small things leaned in the same direction, like trees bending before a storm you can't yet see. I still went about my days. I split wood. I cooked my meals. But I found myself listening more, pausing with a log half raised or a cup halfway to my mouth. The cabin felt just a little less solid, the walls a little thinner. Whatever was moving out there wasn't making itself known. It was only leaving hints, the way someone leaves a light on in a room you thought was empty. And once you notice that light, you can't help but wonder who's inside. I kept an old trail camera strapped to a pine about 50 yards from the chicken coop. I'd put it there years earlier to keep an eye on coyotes, and most of the time, it only caught deer noses and raccoon tails. After everything that had been happening, I checked it more often. The plastic housing was cold when I opened it, a thin layer of frost on the latch, and my breath came out in short white clouds while the screen flickered to life. At first, there was nothing new. A few empty frames where the wind had tripped the motion sensor. Then a rabbit, blurred as it hopped past. I was about to shut it off when I saw a frame that made my thumb stop. The image was dark, taken just before dawn, the edges hazy with moisture on the lens. In the center, behind the fence, something tall was standing between two trees. It wasn't clear enough to make out details, but it was too upright, too narrow to be a bear. The timestamp showed it had been there for several minutes, not just passing through. I leaned closer, squinting at the little screen. My reflection stared back at me, pale and uncertain. I flipped through the next few frames. In each one, that same shape was a little closer, a little more defined. Long arms hung at its sides. The head was rounded, darker than the background. Then, in the last frame before the camera stopped recording, it was gone, leaving only the empty stretch of fence and the trees swaying slightly, as if something had brushed past them. I didn't tell anyone. There wasn't anyone to tell, really. But even if there had been, I wouldn't have known how to start. I just stood there in the cold, the small screen glowing in my hands, and felt something in my chest loosen and tighten at the same time. Later that morning, I saw it with my own eyes. I was hauling a load of split wood from the shed back toward the cabin. The air was sharp, and the sun hadn't yet burned off the thin fog that hung low over the ground. My boots made a soft crunch on the frost, and the only other sound was my own breathing. As I came around the corner of the shed, something moved at the edge of the tree line. Not fast, not slow, just a steady shift, like someone stepping out of shadow into light. It was tall. That was the first thing my mind grabbed onto, as if height alone could explain it. Taller than any man I'd known, its outline dark against the pale trunks. I could see the curve of a shoulder, the bend of an arm. For a moment, it stood still, half hidden by branches, and I had the strange feeling that it was deciding something. The air between us felt thick, as if it were holding its breath. Then it stepped back, quiet as falling ash, and the trees closed around it. I didn't move. The wood slipped from my hands and thudded softly onto the ground, but even that sound felt too loud. My heart was beating in my ears, a slow, heavy drum. I wasn't afraid in the way people think of fear. There was no urge to run or shout. It was more like realizing you've been walking on a frozen lake and just heard it crack. I forced myself to go closer. Each step felt deliberate, the frost slick under my boots. When I reached the spot where it had been, I found the ground pressed down. The grass flattened in a way that didn't match any animal track I knew. There were no clear prints, just broad, deep impressions, as if something heavy had rested there for a moment before lifting away. I knelt and put my hand on the soil. It was still slightly warm, or maybe that was just my imagination, but it made my skin prickle. I walked the line it had taken into the woods, careful not to disturb what little there was to see. Branches were bent, leaves pushed aside. Whatever it was had moved with purpose, not crashing through like a bear or moose. It had gone where it meant to go. Back inside the cabin, I replayed the trail camera footage on my old laptop. The fan whined, struggling, and the screen glowed faintly in the dim room. I watched that dark shape again and again, stepping closer, pausing, disappearing. Each time, I noticed something new. The way it angled its body toward the coop. The way it seemed to keep just beyond the fence, as if respecting some invisible line. I sat there for a long time, the room quiet except for the low hum of the computer and the distant murmur of the creek. I wasn't ready to name what I'd seen. Names make things solid, and I wasn't sure I wanted this to be solid yet. All I knew was that something was out there, something I couldn't explain, and it had been close enough for me to see the way it held itself, the way it chose when to be seen and when to vanish. The proof was there, in grainy footage and in the pressed earth by the trees. But understanding was still far away, just out of reach, waiting in the quiet beyond the cabin walls. After that morning, the woods no longer felt empty. They felt occupied. I didn't see it every day, but I felt it more often than I'd like to admit. There would be moments when the air seemed to thicken, when the birds went quiet all at once, and I would catch myself turning my head toward the trees without knowing why. It wasn't panic. It was a kind of attention, as if some part of me had learned a new sound and was listening for it. The trail camera kept picking up movement. Not enough to give me clear pictures, but enough to confirm what I'd already seen. Sometimes it would trigger and record nothing but a slow sway of branches. Other times there would be a dark blur at the edge of the frame, half a shoulder, a long arm. Never enough to understand, always enough to unsettle. Whatever it was, it knew where the camera was. Of that I became certain. The way it stayed just outside the lens, just beyond the light, didn't feel like accident. I started carrying my old hunting rifle when I went outside, more out of habit than any real intention to use it. The metal was cold against my palm, familiar and steady. Still, there was a quiet knowledge in me that if I did see that tall shape again, the rifle wouldn't be the thing that decided what happened next. That thought sat heavy in my chest. Once, near sunset, I was repairing a loose board on the chicken coop when I felt that same pressure in the air. The light was low and amber, throwing long shadows across the ground. I looked up, and there it was, standing just inside the tree line. Not close, not far. Far enough that it could leave if it wanted to. Close enough that I could see the way its head tilted slightly, the way it held itself still. We stayed like that for several seconds, maybe longer. I could hear my own breath, the faint rustle of leaves in a light breeze. It didn't move toward me. It didn't retreat. It just watched. There was no threat in its posture, no raised arms or bared teeth, just a steady, patient presence. Then a chicken clucked, loud and sudden, and the thing stepped back into the trees, disappearing as quietly as it had come. I found myself going over those moments again and again. The way it chose when to be seen, the way it never crossed into the open. It was as if it understood the lines of my world better than I did, knew where the edges were. The animals noticed it too. The deer began to return to the meadow, but only in the early morning when the light was thin and gray. They stayed closer together, their heads lifting in unison at the smallest sound. Rusty would sometimes stand on the porch, nose in the air, and wag his tail slowly, not in greeting, but in a kind of uncertain acknowledgement. Whatever was out there didn't make him bark the way a stranger would. It made him watch. There were small signs of care, though I didn't recognize them as such at the time. One morning, I found a section of my fence straightened where it had been pushed down. The wire was bent back into place, not neatly, but enough to keep the goats from wandering. Another time, after a storm, a fallen branch that had blocked the path to the shed was moved aside, dragged just far enough that I could walk through without climbing. The bark was scraped, the ground scuffed in a wide. Careful walk. I tried to tell myself these things had simple explanations. Wind, gravity, maybe even some bored kids from town. Though the idea of anyone hiking all the way out here, just to fix my fence, didn't make much sense. Still, the pattern was there. Things changed, but nothing was damaged. Nothing was taken. I became more uncertain and afraid. It's a strange feeling, realizing that something unknown is sharing your space, but not meaning you harm. I would sit at the kitchen table at night, the lamp casting a soft circle of light, and feel as if there were another presence just beyond the walls, patient and still. Sometimes I'd hear a soft footfall outside, too heavy to be a deer, too quiet to be a bear. Rusty would lift his head, ears forward, and then settle again. Whatever it was learning me. The times I went out, the places I walked, the way I left scraps by the compost pile. And I, without meaning to, was learning it too. Its rhythm, its distance, the way it kept to the edges, never stepping fully into my world. By the end of that week, the woods no longer felt threatening. They felt observed. And that was somehow more unsettling, because it meant I was no longer alone out here in the way I had always believed. The first time I left food out for it, I didn't tell myself I was doing anything unusual. I just called it practicality. I had more venison than I needed, and the freezer was full. So one evening, as the light slid down behind the ridge and the air turned sharp, I took a small bundle of meat and set it on a flat rock near the tree line. The stone was cold through my gloves, and I remember thinking how quiet everything was. Even the creek seemed to be keeping its voice low. I didn't stay to watch. I went back inside, closed the door, and sat at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it ever had. Every so often, I found myself glancing toward the window, half expecting to see a shadow move across the glass. Nothing did. The woods stayed dark and still. When I went out the next morning, the meat was gone. Not dragged away. Not scattered. Just gone. In its place, the rock was clean, wiped free of blood and scraps. The frost around it was disturbed in a wide, careful circle, pressed down by something heavy that had knelt or crouched there. I stood for a long time, the cold biting at my cheeks, and felt a slow, careful warmth spread through me. It wasn't happiness. It was recognition. I left food again that night. And the night after that. Sometimes venison, sometimes old bread, sometimes apples that had gone soft. Each time it disappeared, and each time there was that same wide pattern in the frost, like a signature. I began to notice how it came after I had gone inside, never before. It wasn't taking. It was accepting. There were other changes, too. The coyotes that used to circle close at night stopped coming. I would hear them far off now, their calls thin and distant, like they were speaking from another valley. Once, when a pair of wolves moved through the area, Rusty went stiff on the porch, a low growl in his chest. I reached for my rifle, but before I could step out, there was a deep single sound from the woods. Not a roar, not a call, just a low, steady note that seemed to come from the ground itself. The wolves went quiet, and a moment later I heard them retreating, their paws moving fast over the frozen leaves. Nothing else approached the cabin that night. I started to see a pattern in the way it moved. It would appear at the same 2 points along the tree line, always at a distance, always when the light was low. It never came closer while I was outside, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there, watching, the way a farmer watches a field, patient and aware. Sometimes I'd lift a hand, not in greeting exactly, but in acknowledgement. It never responded, but it didn't go away. One evening, the air thick with the smell of rain, I was bringing in a bucket of feed when I slipped on the wet boards and went down hard. Pain shot through my hip, sharp and bright, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The bucket rolled, grain spilling out in a soft hiss. Rusty barked once, then fell silent. I lay there, staring up at the gray sky, the drizzle cold on my face. When I finally managed to sit up, I saw it at the edge of the clearing, closer than it had ever been before. It wasn't rushing toward me. It wasn't reaching out. It was just there, its tall shape steady against the rain. I felt no threat from it, only a strange, solid presence, like a wall between me and whatever else might have come. After a moment, it stepped back, retreating into the trees, and I realized my hands were shaking. From then on, the exchanges became routine. I left food. It took it. The fence stayed mended. The paths stayed clear. The woods around the cabin felt held in a way I had never known before. I still didn't know what it was. I still didn't understand why it had chosen this place, or me. But something had shifted between us. A quiet agreement written in footprints and empty plates. Trust is not something that arrives all at once. It builds in small, careful ways, like frost on a window. By the time I realized I was no longer afraid, it had already been there for a while, standing just beyond the trees, keeping watch. Trouble doesn't announce itself out here. It arrives the way weather does, quiet at first, carried on a wind you don't notice until the trees start to lean. The first sign was the trucks. I heard them before I saw them. A low mechanical growl rolling through the valley, out of place among the usual sounds of creek and birds. Rusty lifted his head, ears forward, a short, uneasy whine in his throat. Dust rose on the old dirt road, hanging in the pale afternoon light like a thin fog. When the trucks finally came into view, there were two of them, dark and heavy, tires biting into the soft ground. They didn't belong here. No one who did belong this far out came in like that. 3 men got out. They wore heavy boots and jackets that didn't quite fit the land, too clean, too stiff. One of them had a rifle slung over his shoulder, not the kind a hunter carries for deer, but something built for distance and damage. Another carried a set of binoculars and kept scanning the tree line, his eyes moving in sharp, quick motions. They told me they were hunters. Said they'd heard rumors of something big moving through the area, something worth a lot of money. One of them smiled when he said it, but his eyes didn't change. I stood on the porch, the wood warm under my boots, and felt that familiar pressure in the air. The woods were quiet, too quiet, as if they were listening. I told them there was nothing out here but deer and old trees. They nodded, like people do when they've already made up their minds. When they left, they didn't go back the way they'd come. They turned down a side track that led deeper into the valley, toward the ridge where I had first seen that tall shape. That night, the wolves came closer than they had in weeks. Their howls were sharper, closer together, as if they were being pushed. I heard movement in the woods more than usual, the crack of branches and the heavy tread of something running. Rusty paced the floor, nails clicking on the boards. I sat by the window with my rifle across my lap, not knowing who or what I was more worried about. The next morning I found boot prints near the tree line, pressed deep into the soft earth. They crossed through the same area where I'd been leaving food, cutting straight across that quiet, careful circle in the frost. Something in me tightened at the sight. The pattern had been broken. Later that day, I heard a gunshot echo through the valley. Then another. The sound bounced off the hills, sharp and final, nothing like the muffled pop of a hunter taking a deer. These were loud, careless shots meant to scare as much as kill. Rusty barked once and then went still, eyes fixed on the door. I walked out as far as I dared, keeping to the edge of the clearing. The air smelled of burnt powder and wet leaves. Somewhere in the woods, a branch snapped, followed by a deep, rushing sound, like something large moving fast. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the tension in the ground, the way you can feel a storm building, even when the sky is still clear. That evening, one of the men came back alone. His jacket was torn, and there was a smear of blood on his sleeve, not his own. He didn't smile this time. He asked me if I'd seen anything big move through the area, something that didn't belong. I shook my head, keeping my voice calm. He studied me for a long moment, then turned and left, heading back toward the ridge. When darkness fell, the woods came alive in a way I had never heard before. There were shouts, distant and angry, the crack of branches. Once, a scream cut through the night, short and sharp, then nothing. The wind carried the sounds in broken pieces, enough to tell me that whatever was out there was no longer just watching. Through it all, there was that other presence moving closer, not to me, but around me. I felt it the way you feel a wall behind you in the dark. Protective. Solid dot by morning, the valley was quiet again. Too quiet. One of the trucks was gone. The other sat crooked on the road, its door hanging open. No one came back to claim it. The wolves stayed away. The birds were slow to return. Whatever those men had come looking for, they had found something instead, and it was not what they had expected. The quiet after something bad has happened is never peaceful. It feels like the world is holding its breath, waiting to see what will come next. That was the kind of quiet that settled over the valley after the men disappeared. Even the creek seemed to run softer, as if it were trying not to be heard. I went out that morning to check the road. The air was cold and bright, the kind of winter light that makes every shadow look sharp. One of the trucks was still there, sitting at an angle like it had been abandoned in a hurry. The door was open, the inside empty except for a few wrappers and a map folded on the seat. The wind moved the door back and forth, making it creak on its hinges. That sound scraped at my nerves. I should have gone back inside. I know that now. But curiosity and a kind of stubborn sense of responsibility pushed me forward. I followed the tracks leading away from the truck. Deep boot prints mixed with dragged lines where something heavy had been pulled. They led toward the lower ravine, a place where the ground drops away into a tangle of rocks and deadfall. The air down there always smells damp, even when everything else is dry. The path was narrow and slick with frost. My boots slipped more than once, and each time my heart jumped into my throat. When I reached the edge, I saw what had happened. One of the men lay partway down the slope, tangled in brush, his rifle broken beside him. He wasn't moving. I didn't go closer. I didn't need to dodge as I turned to leave. My foot slid out from under me. There was a moment of weightlessness, a cold rush in my ears, and then I was tumbling down after him. Branches tore at my jacket. Rocks bruised my ribs. When I finally stopped, the breath was knocked out of me in a sharp, painful gasp. I lay there for a long time, staring up at a slice of pale sky framed by dark branches. Every breath hurt. My leg was twisted at an angle it shouldn't have been, a deep, sickening pain radiating up my side. I tried to move and couldn't. The cold crept in through my clothes, seeping into my bones. I was alone down there, in a place no one ever came. My radio was still clipped to my belt, but when I tried to call out, all I got was static. The ravine swallowed the sound. Rusty's bark was a distant echo far above, too far to matter. The day wore on. The light shifted, growing weaker. Shadows stretched across the rocks. I could hear water dripping somewhere, slow and steady, like a clock counting down. I knew what would happen if I stayed there. Shock, hypothermia, the kind of quiet ending that doesn't look like much from the outside. I thought about the cabin, the stove, the kettle, all the small, ordinary things that made up my world. I felt them slipping away, not in a dramatic rush, but in a slow, steady fade. There was no one to call. No one who could hear me. No help possible. As the cold deepened, I became aware of a familiar pressure in the air. It was faint at first, like a change in the weather. Then I heard it, a soft, heavy movement above me, branches bending under weight. I couldn't see anything from where I lay, just the dark of the trees and the pale strip of sky. I didn't know if it was coming for me or just passing by. All I knew was that I didn't have the strength left to be afraid. I closed my eyes, listening to the slow, steady sounds of something large moving closer, and waited. I don't know how long I lay there before the ground began to change around me. At first, it was just a vibration, a low tremor that ran through the rocks and into my bones. It wasn't an earthquake. It was more like the steady pressure of something heavy shifting its weight. The sound came next, a deep, careful breathing, slow and controlled. Close enough that I could feel it on my skin like a faint breeze. When I opened my eyes, the light above me was blocked out. It stood at the edge of the ravine, its outline filling that narrow strip of sky. Up close, it was even taller than I had imagined, broad through the shoulders, its body dark against the pale winter light. I could see the texture of its skin or fur. I'm still not sure which, rough and uneven, catching bits of leaf and frost. It didn't bare its teeth. It didn't make a sound beyond that slow breathing. It just looked down at me, and for the first time since I'd seen it, I understood that it was looking at me, not past me, not through me, but at me. There was no fear in that gaze. There was focused. It climbed down into the ravine with a careful strength that didn't match its size. Rocks shifted under its weight, but it placed its feet with a precision that kept them from rolling. A branch snapped, loud in the quiet, and I flinched, but it didn't. It moved the way someone does when they know exactly how much force to use. When it reached me, it crouched. The ground dipped under its weight. I could smell it then, a mix of damp earth and old wood, not unpleasant, just strong. One long arm reached out, stopping a few inches from my chest, as if it were asking permission. I couldn't give any, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Its hand was large enough to cover my ribcage. The fingers were thick, the skin rough, but the touch was gentle. It slid one arm under my shoulders and the other beneath my legs, lifting me with a steady, even motion. Pain flared bright and sharp, and I gasped, but it adjusted, shifting its grip until the pressure eased. It was holding me the way a person would hold a child, careful and secure. The climb out of the ravine was slow. Each step was deliberate. I could feel its muscles working under its skin, powerful and controlled. When rocks gave way, it adjusted without losing balance. At one point, a loose stone tumbled down past us, clattering into the darkness below. It didn't startle. It just kept going. The air grew colder as we rose, and I could feel my own breath fogging against its chest. My head rested against something warm and solid. For a moment, despite everything, I felt strangely safe. Cradled there above the ground. When it reached the top, it set me down on a patch of flat earth. The sky was a washed-out gray, and snow had begun to fall in soft, drifting flakes. It knelt beside me, its head lowering, as if it were studying my face. I was shaking now from cold and shock, but its presence steadied me in a way I can't quite explain. It did something then that I didn't expect. It took off a small pack that had been slung across its shoulder, something I had never seen it carry before. From inside, it pulled out a piece of cloth, rough but clean, and used it to press against the cut on my leg. The pressure was firm but careful, stopping the blood. I stared at it, my mind struggling to catch up. It wasn't just strong. It was prepared. When the bleeding slowed, it stood and looked toward the cabin. The distance was far from me, impossible in my condition, but nothing for it. It bent down again, lifting me as easily as before, and began to move through the woods. The journey was a blur of cold air, dark branches, and the steady rhythm of its steps. I could hear my own heart, slow and heavy, and the quiet sound of its breathing. Once, I felt a hand adjust its grip to keep me from slipping. The touch was sure, familiar now. When we reached the clearing, the cabin came into view, a small solid shape against the snow. It carried me all the way to the porch and lowered me gently onto the boards. The wood was cold, but it was home. It stepped back, standing just beyond the edge of the light from the window. For a long moment, we looked at each other. The snow fell between us, soft and silent. I wanted to speak, to say something that would make sense of what had just happened. But there were no words for it. Then it turned and walked back into the trees, its tall shape fading into the gray, leaving me alive where I should not have been. I woke up 2 days later with the sound of the stove ticking as it cooled. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and boiled herbs, the way it always does when I've been sick or hurt. My leg was wrapped tight, splinted the best I could manage, and every part of me felt old and bruised. But I was alive, and I was inside, and that alone told me more than any doctor could. There were tracks on the porch wide, deep impressions in the thin layer of snow, careful and steady. They led right up to where I was lying when I'd been set down, then turned back toward the trees. I stared at them for a long time, the morning light pale through the window, and something quiet settled in me. I went over everything again in my head. The mended fence, the cleared paths, the way the wolves had stayed away, the food taken but never wasted, the careful distance, the watching, the timing. None of it looked like random behavior anymore. It looked like something that had been paying attention. It had been there when the men came. I was sure of that now. It had known they were trouble before I did. Maybe before they even stepped out of their trucks. It had kept the animals back, kept the woods quiet, the way someone keeps a house still when there's danger nearby. When they started shooting, it hadn't run. It had acted. And when I fell, when I was broken and cold at the bottom of that ravine, it hadn't hesitated. I tried to picture it as a monster, the way people do when they talk about things they don't understand. Teeth, claws, rage. None of that fit what I had seen. It moved with care. It used its strength to lift, not to strike. It had brought supplies. It had known how to stop bleeding. That isn't instinct. That's intention. Out here, you learn to read intention. You have to. A storm that means to kill you feels different from one that's just passing through. A bear that means to charge moves different from one that just wants to be left alone. What had been living in these woods had never meant me harm. If anything, it had been shaping the land around me to keep me safe. I hobbled to the window and looked out at the tree line. The snow was still falling, light and steady, softening every edge. Somewhere beyond those trunks, it was there, watching, the way it always had. Not because it owned this place, but because it had chosen it. Because it had chosen me. The idea sat heavy and gentle in my chest. I wasn't special. I wasn't important in any grand way. I was just a man living alone in a quiet valley. But I was part of a pattern now, one I hadn't seen until it revealed itself. People ask why it stayed hidden, why it never came closer, never stepped fully into my world. I think it understood something about us that we often forget. We don't do well when the impossible stands in front of us. We want to name it, to control it, to break it down into pieces that fit our thinking. It didn't want that. It wanted the simple truth of being what it was, in the place it had chosen, and so it stayed in the trees. It watched from the edges. It guarded what was its to guard. That's what it was, in the end. Not a creature from a story. Not a shadow in the woods. A guardian, doing what guardians do in the only way it knew how. Quietly. Life has a way of finding its old rhythm again, even after something breaks it. It doesn't come back all at once. It comes in small, ordinary pieces. A kettle warming on the stove. The creak of a floorboard under a careful step. The sound of wind moving through the trees the way it always has. After the fall, after the men, after everything that happened in the ravine, those small sounds were what brought me back. My leg never healed the way it used to. It aches when the weather shifts, and I walk slower now, a little stiff in the mornings. But I still get up before the light, still pull on my boots and step out onto the porch. The air out here is sharp and clean, and the sky opens wide above the trees, pale and endless. The creek still runs, knocking stones together in its quiet way. The deer still come to the meadow, careful but steady. The world didn't change. I did. The food exchange never stopped. I leave things on the same flat rock near the tree line. Sometimes it's meat, sometimes bread, sometimes fruit. I don't make a ceremony of it. I just set it down and go back inside. By morning, it's always gone, and the frost around it is pressed in that familiar wide circle. There's comfort in that pattern. It's like seeing footprints on a trail, you know? Well, proof that someone else walks there too. I don't try to see it anymore. Not the way I used to. I don't stand at the edge of the clearing and wait for a shape to appear. I've learned that watching works better when it goes both ways. Sometimes, when the light is just right, I'll catch a sense of it. A change in the air. A quiet presence just beyond the trees. That's enough. Rusty still lifts his head sometimes, tail wagging slow, eyes focused on a place I can't quite see. I've learned to trust that too. If he's calm, so am I. The land feels different now. Not owned. Not empty. Held. There's a kind of care in it that wasn't there before, or maybe I just wasn't able to feel it. Fences stay mended. Paths stay clear. When storms come through, the worst of the damage is always just far enough away to leave the cabin standing. I don't question it anymore. I just live inside it. People still don't come out here much. That's fine by me. This place doesn't belong to the outside world in the way towns and roads do. It belongs to the quiet, to the slow turn of seasons, to whatever has chosen to stand guard in the trees. I belong here too, in my small, careful way. Sometimes, late at night, I sit by the window with a cup of coffee and listen to the woods. The wind moves through the branches. An owl calls from somewhere far off. There are heavier sounds too, soft and steady, like someone shifting their weight in the dark. I don't look for it. I just let it be there. What happened to me could have been the end. A man alone in a ravine, cold and broken, isn't supposed to come back. But I did. Not because I was strong. Not because I was lucky. Because something impossible chose to protect something ordinary. That's the truth I carry now. Out here, in this quiet valley, life goes on the way it always has. The days pass. The seasons turn. And somewhere beyond the tree line, unseen but steady, something watches over it all. So do I, from my small cabin, listening to the world breathe, grateful for the quiet, and for the company that never asks to be seen.